Well, the Rani is back, and so is the Rani, or Mrs. Flood, I suppose we've got to call her. It's been a week since we've delved into the Interstellar Song Contest, and we're back with the first part of the finale of the second season, which is also the 15th season of Doctor Who. Confused yet? You will be. Now, this video is going to contain some spoilers, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, please do make sure that you go and watch that before watching this. And if you're still here, then I hope that you will join me as we go beyond the sofa. Firstly, I've got to start off with an apology. I always say to people that they should leave a comment, and I do read all the comments, and I have read all the comments this week, and I've tried to respond to all of the comments this week as well. But because I've been ridiculously busy, I didn't get to those comments until very, very late last night. So I apologize for not doing that sooner. Secondly, I'd just like to take a minute to say this. A few people commented on the video last week saying that this wasn't a reaction video. And to them, I would like to say, this is how I react to things. And that's because I'm not 12. I'm going to do this sort of thing. I'm not going to sit gaping at a screen and screaming when a character who hasn't been in the show for 60 years suddenly pops up. Fixing scripts and understanding the nuances of a script fairly quickly is something that I used to do for a job. It's something that you could say I've been trained to do. I think it's something that I can uniquely bring to the table when talking about Doctor Who. But this isn't a review, because a review would be a lot more nuanced. Sorry, it'd go much further into the details of what's working and what isn't. And honestly, I think that a review should contain all of the different reactions, all of the different bits of information, take into account what's said behind the scenes. And I don't do that. I look at the script as I've just seen it and I react to it. And that's what you're going to get in these videos. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but that's what these are. Anyway, on to some housekeeping. The ratings this week, 2.57 million on the overnights, which is pretty good for what the series has been so far. One of the larger ones of the series, and probably being on before Eurovision has helped that quite a lot. Possibly being Eurovision themed might have helped that as well. It was the third most watched programme of the day, of course the first two being the FA Cup and Eurovision, but it actually doubled the viewership over the direct comparison with ITV. So nothing on ITV in that primetime slot had anywhere like the viewers that Doctor Who had, which is very good. That's a really good sign. So at least for last week, the television audience were actually tuning in to watch Doctor Who in its time slot rather than anything else on television. We also have the consolidated from the story in the engine, and that managed 2.7 million viewers. So that's actually down over previous episodes, and I wonder whether that's, rather than people not watching it, that's people not re-watching it, since it was an episode that had pretty mixed reviews. It'd be interesting to find out. We also had some articles this week saying that Ncuti had been axed from Doctor Who. Now, I wouldn't instantly dismiss any of those articles, but at the same time, like I said last week, newspapers in the UK have a habit of not telling the truth or telling an edited truth, especially the red tops. And so, again, I would caution anybody to take all of that just with a pinch of salt. And does that mean Ncuti is staying? No, God, no. Does it mean that he's going? Well, no. Again, we don't know. And let's just wait and see how it plays out. But to get to that point, what we really need to do is take a look at today's episode, Wishworld, where we find the Doctor and Belinda have finally made it back to Earth. And at the end of last episode, the TARDIS's doors exploded. And this week, it's actually a bit difficult to know where to start with this, because what we're getting here isn't a fully rounded story, and it's not meant to be. We're getting the first part of a two-parter. So in that respect, this is an awful lot more like The Legend of Ruby Sunday. But with The Legend of Ruby Sunday, we had at least got some resolution of some of the points that were being brought up during the series. And with Wishworld, we don't. And that's kind of okay, because that's not what this has to do. This episode really, if you think about it, this episode's job is to get you interested to find out what's going to happen next week. And it does that. It does that very well. It leaves the audience with questions that we think we're going to get answers to next time. That we're confident, in fact, are going to be resolved by the end of the next episode. And to be honest, that's usually how you get people through the door. It's something akin to what J.J. Abrams would call the mystery box.
One more day till May the 24th. Any plans?
So, a mystery box is a story technique where the central mystery, the unanswered question, is the thing that is driving the plot along. And here we have that. Why is the Doctor stuck where he is? What's going on? Why don't people remember the real world or their usual life? And mystery boxes will withhold important bits of information to maintain that intrigue. And it encourages viewers to keep watching because eventually they'll want to know what's inside the box. We start off with the Doctor enjoying what is supposedly a normal life with Belinda as his wife and Poppy as his daughter. And he's taken on the name of John Smith, but he hasn't done this knowingly. He's been put into this place. Now, that's nothing new in terms of sci-fi. If you're a sci-fi fan, you've been here before many times, and we all know what's going to happen in the end. But this question of why it's happening and what's going on, it's central to you wanting to keep watching the episode. Because in all honesty, without that, it's fairly mundane, and it isn't the first time that that's happened as well. These stories tend to be fairly mundane. They tend to throw little nuggets of information along the way. The Doctor meeting Ruby for the first time as an example. Ruby just turning up at his door, it's a little nugget. It's, we know things aren't right because we know what the normal universe is like in this instance, and that's not what we're getting here. We have things like Mel, who is a character, we all know she's on Earth. We all know who she is. So, why wouldn't she be in this episode? But also, she doesn't need to do anything. None of the ancillary characters actually need to do anything because they're not really serving an overall story. They're there as a sort of pseudo window dressing to ground us in concepts and characters that we're familiar with. So, we're asking those questions about the story. We're asking, well, how has it affected everybody the way that it's, affected this person over here? Why hasn't it affected some people? And it's almost fun in itself to see characters that you're already familiar with being portrayed in a different light. If their life has diverged slightly, would they be completely different people? It's the sliding doors principle. But in other stories, usually because you've got a little bit more time and a bit more space to explain things, you might actually delve a little bit deeper into the lives of those other people, into how their lives are different in this new reality as opposed to the old one. Of course, you don't really need that here. Yeah, we're showing the old characters. We want to see that their lives are different, but really, we still want to focus on that central question. So what's interesting in this instance isn't that all of those characters are cropping up. That they're still serving the central premise, the central idea that we need to know what's happened to the Doctor because we know that his reality is not right. And of course, that links us back to the Rani and to the beginning of the episode, where we see the Rani take a baby who is the seventh son of a seventh son. Again, playing into the mythos around witches and wizards and witchcraft and magic and all of that sort of thing. So in mythology, the number 7 is something that is really powerful. It's something that Terry Pratchett satirized by having the number 8 be the number of magic on the Discworld. So in Discworld books, it's the 8th son of an 8th son. But in reality, this idea that if you were the 7th son of a 7th son, you were somehow special, somehow magically special, is something that is rooted in everything that we've been talking about in terms of the gods, in terms of the pantheon, in terms of bringing mythology into Doctor Who. And that's something that I haven't minded in the rest of the run, but I think that that's largely because a lot of these instances, a lot of these plot points can be a kind of take it or leave it thing. And I suppose this one could be as well, but I did feel like having so much of that cold open be leaning towards the seventh son of a seventh son idea did make it feel a little bit more important. Something you couldn't get away from. And in some respects, I think that the whole mythology thing is kind of starting to detract from what Doctor Who is at its core. Now, I was somebody who was very excited to see where that mythology thing went, because in the past, Doctor Who has always done mythology as a relation to cosmic horror, essentially. So you have episodes like Image of the Fendal, where the Fendal is a creature that exists in Time Lord mythology, but also one that could comfortably exist in a science fiction framework. It is at one and the same time both an ancient myth and a modern alien. But what we have had with the Pantheon is something a little bit different from that. We've been leaning much deeper into myths and mythology and a kind of foregoing the idea that the mythology could sit comfortably in this sci-fi setting. Which is interesting because even Lovecraft had that cosmic as a big part of his gods. And that's not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that seems to be changing the show, and I'm not entirely sure that that changes for the best. And whilst I'm not adverse to that sort of change, I do wonder if it's going to turn people off from what was essentially a family sci-fi show. But there's still an awful lot to like here. Not only is the episode visually interesting, you have questions about where these giant dinosaur bones are coming from. You've got Ruby. Ruby's story is actually one of the most interesting parts of the episode. Presumably because she's travelled with the Doctor, she can see that something is wrong. The fact that Mel has also travelled with the Doctor and doesn't appear to have those same issues is a little bit of a contradiction, I'll give you, but we could put that down to the recency of Ruby's travels in the TARDIS or something like that. We have the disabled and the dispossessed as people who could see the world differently, mostly because it appears at least that Conrad can't see them, or at least doesn't want to think about them. There is something really interesting about Conrad saying that if he just thinks, or stops thinking rather, for a few minutes, then Africa's going to flood or natural disasters happen.
Sometimes I forget about the weather and South Africa gets flooded.
He really is the catalyst for all of these wishes, even though the power is coming from the baby. We have that moment, and as I've said before, there's spoilers in this. We have that moment here where Rogue comes back for that fleeting glimpse on the television as his world is about to fall into some sort of abyss, and he warns the Doctor. And it's such a great idea of, tables don't work like that. And of course they don't. And we all know that they don't. But at that point, we start to see the Doctor realizing that all is not well, and having that doubt be an energy source. That's an interesting thing. It's a classic fantasy trope that, emotion and human nature, that's the thing that drives the power of magic in this universe. It's a really interesting concept, and I enjoyed that. I liked the fact that the Vindicator was something supposedly the Rani had set up herself, and something that the Doctor unwittingly fell into. But it's very difficult to say much more about this episode because it's just all set up. And it was good setup. It was interesting seeing the Doctor in his new life, going to work, and in that sort of 1950s style futurism with a modern twist. It was interesting seeing Poppy again, and Poppy clearly has something big happening in the next episode. Now, I've said this before, I'm not one for spoilers. Or at least, fan things and that. But there does seem to be some question as to whether Poppy is going to end up being something connected with the Time Lords, either the Doctor's actual daughter or, I don't know, something like that. It'll be interesting to find out. But at the same time, this is always a problem with mystery boxes. I'm not entirely sure that the promises that have been set up in this episode are ones that are going to be able to be realized and comfortably and satisfactorily answered in the next one. Because what's going to happen now is that we're all going to go away and we're going to spend a week thinking about it. And at least on some level, something that we come up with ourselves is going to feel better than anything Russell T Davies can come up with for a finale. And that's bound to happen because we've got our own personal preferences. So, of course, if we think of something, we're going to think that our preference for a story is a better one. So the whole mystery box thing, it's very difficult to get right, and it's so easy for it to backfire. And I think that's what we saw last season with Ruby Sunday. You know, the promises that were made right away at the beginning of the season, all about Ruby being somebody special, and then the realization at the end that actually she isn't. And we've gone on this massive journey, and, you know, people have really bought into the idea that, and they've gone on this journey, and then they didn't get the resolution that they deserved, really. Bringing Omega back, however you say that, Omega is how it was pronounced in the classic series. It's interesting, but of course, much like the end of last season, we didn't see a lot of him. He didn't do anything. He was just a setup for the next episode. But that in itself leaves this question dangling in midair. Doctor Who is a series which has it's got a very long history, and it's a series where that history has been explored in many ways, shapes and forms over the last 60 years. Even callbacks as soon as Patrick Troughton's regeneration happened, they just didn't happen as frequently.
You can't understand being so ancient.
Eh?
I mean old.
Oh.
You probably can't remember your family.
Oh, yes, I can when I want to. And that's the point, really. I have to really want to bring them back in front of my eyes. The rest of the time, they sleep in my mind, and I forget. And so will you. Oh, yes, you will. You'll find there's so much else to think about, to remember.
But the weight of that history can be a problem, especially when we're told last season that it was something that if you were brand new to Doctor Who, that you'd be able to pick up and the stories wouldn't get confusing. And you're not suddenly going to be bombarded with a whole lot of lore that you have to go and learn. And what's happened is that actually you have been bombarded with a whole lot of lore. We've not just had Sutekh, we've gone back to the last of the Time Lords. We've now got Omega, we've got the Rani, we had the Midnight Entity, Susan, the Toymaker, all in the last 3 years. And that's an awful lot for any season of Doctor Who, especially when those seasons have been truncated to 8 episodes per run. If I was a brand new fan to this, and if I didn't have access to that 60 years worth of television, for whatever reason, maybe I just don't want to sit through that much television all in one go, I could very well be getting lost at this point. And I do wonder whether, we're struggling for casual viewers right now. And I do wonder whether part of that is the fact that Doctor Who at the moment seems to be taking too much of the weight of its own history on its shoulders. As well as that, and again, because you've got this big reveal that comes up at the end, what we don't know is what the Rani's motivation for anything that she's doing is. We know now, because, or at least we think we know now, because we've seen that reveal is Omega. But we don't really understand that in the episode, and that can leave the thing feeling a little bit disjointed. And despite what the Rani says...
Because this isn't just exposition, Doctor.
It is just exposition, and we get an awful lot of it dumped at the end of the episode. It's nearly as bad as the Timeless Child exposition, but that took over most of the episode and deserves its own special place in exposition hell because of it. So I don't think it's really fair to make a proper conclusion about what I think about the episode right now, because right now what I'm thinking about is, well, we've only had half the story. What we've had was an episode where it's quite fun to be asking all of these questions and to be setting up little pockets that we're hoping to see some resolution to next week. But until we see that resolution, we can't know if it's going to be fully realized. And I'm really saying that because on its own, this episode just doesn't land for me. And I think it's important to realize that the reason for that is probably because we haven't seen the resolution to it. It could still all go horribly wrong. It did last year with Empire of Death. But until then, I think reserving judgment is possibly the fairest thing to do. I will say, if you tuned into this episode not knowing that it's a two-parter, you're not getting a really interesting two-part story where the two parts can exist independently and coexist as a full story. So something like The Empty Child and The Doctor Dances does the whole two-part thing an awful lot better, because even though you get a ramp up to the second episode at the end of episode 1, you still at least get some of the resolution in the episode that people are craving, which I do think we're missing here. And let's be really clear, the resolution isn't just, well, we know this isn't right for the Doctor, so we need to get to a point where the Doctor's got his memory back. A resolution would be something where you've opened up the loops in the first part of the story and then you close some of those loops as you get to the end. And by the time you get to the second part, the loops that are still open are the things that are going to pull you through into watching part 2. And what do I mean by loops? Well, I should explain that. So in advertising copy, as well as in story structure, you have what's called a loop. And you can open a loop by giving the audience a question that they want answered. And then you can close that loop by answering the question. It's as simple as that, really. So a story is essentially lots of loops opening, some of them closing, and some more opening, and some of them closing. Mystery Box Television does this all the time. It's got one central question, one central loop, and lots of other little loops that get opened along the side. And then over time, those are closed off, and the new ones are opened until you get to the point where the main loop is resolved. And I'm not seeing a lot of closed loops here. And whilst, again, we have to see what happens next week, I feel like I'm droning on about that at the moment, that doesn't necessarily make for a satisfying episode. And even though there's a lot of elements here that are good, that are visually interesting, that are sartorially interesting as well, it doesn't mean that the episode as a standalone entity is satisfying. Whereas something like The Empty Child actually is. But that's what I think. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I will read them all. I can't promise I'll respond to them because actually I am pretty busy at the moment. But I'll do my best, and I'll probably get to them later the night before the next episode, as I did with this week. But thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I hope that you'll join me again when we take a look at the final episode of this season. And possibly some fallout around it. I don't know. But until then, thanks very much for coming along. And please join me next week when we go Beyond the Sofa.